Marcus Devlin shoved the barrel of his gun into the mouth of a 60-year-old man in a wheelchair and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not the smile of someone who hadn't thought this through. It was a slow, deliberate smile, the kind that said he had done this before and enjoyed every second of it. The old man's hands shook so badly that the paper cup of water he'd been holding fell and hit the floor, and Marcus watched it roll away without moving his eyes. "Nobody leaves," he said. "Nobody calls. And nobody does anything stupid, or Grandpa here loses the back of his head all over that pretty white wall." He cocked the hammer. The sound cut through Veterans Memorial Hospital like a blade. If you are watching this right now, do me one favor before we go any further. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it, because what happens next inside that hospital is something nobody in that room will ever forget. Amara Oi Mensah had been a nurse at Veterans Memorial Hospital for exactly 41 days. 41 days of learning where the supply closets were, of memorizing which doctors liked their charts, in what order of apologizing when the coffee cart was out of the roast. Dr. Hendricks preferred, even though she had nothing to do with the coffee cart. 41 days of smiling at jokes she did not find funny, and staying late to finish charting that technically belonged to the previous shift because she was new, and new people did not make enemies. Her scrubs were a size too large. She had ordered mediums and they sent larges, and she hadn't gotten around to exchanging them, so the sleeves bunched a little at her wrists, and the hem dropped past her hips in a way that made her look younger than 34. Her hair was cropped close to her head, shorter than most of the other nurses wore theirs, and Debbie from the third floor had actually asked her once if she was going through something personal. "You know, with the hair," Debbie had said, gesturing vaguely at her own head. Amara had said no and smiled, and Debbie had looked unconvinced. She was standing at the nurse's station on the ground floor emergency wing when the first shot went off. It wasn't in the room. It was somewhere down the corridor near the main entrance, and the sound bounced off the tile floors and the low ceiling and arrived at Amara's ears as something sharp and final. Half the people in the waiting area flinched. Some stood up. One woman grabbed her child and pressed the child's face into her shoulder. The second shot came 4 seconds later. And then Marcus Devlin walked through the double doors at the end of the hall with a gun in his right hand and two men behind him, both armed, both moving with the loose, swaggering confidence of people who believed they were the most dangerous thing in any room they walked into. "Phones on the floor," Marcus said. He wasn't shouting. That was the first thing Amara noticed. He was using his regular voice the way you might ask someone to pass the salt. "Every phone, every one of you, on the floor. And if I see anyone texting or calling or so much as opening an app, I will put a bullet through the hand that's holding it." We clear. People started putting phones on the floor. A man near the window, heavy-set, maybe 60, started to stand up. One of the men behind Marcus, the taller one with a red bandana around his wrist, crossed the room in 4 steps and shoved the man back into his seat so hard the chair skidded sideways and the man nearly went over. "He said phones," the tall one said. "He didn't say stand up." Amara set her phone on the counter. Then she moved it off the counter and put it in her scrub pocket instead, because the counter was visible from where Marcus was standing and her pocket was not. She did this without thinking about it. Her body just did it the way her body did a lot of things without consulting the part of her brain that was currently cataloging exits. There were 3. The double doors Marcus had come through, the service corridor behind the nurse's station that ran to the loading dock, and the stairwell door at the far end of the waiting area, past the row of plastic chairs, past the vending machine, past the man in the wheelchair who was still holding his breath. The man in the wheelchair was named Gerald. She knew this because she had checked his blood pressure twice that morning, and he had told her about his grandson's Little League game in enough detail that she could probably coach the team. Gerald was 72 years old and had served 2 tours in Korea as a young man and had survived both and was currently recovering from a hip replacement, and he was now sitting 6 feet away from a man who had just pressed a gun into his mouth, and the expression on Gerald's face was not the expression of a man who was afraid. It was the expression of a man who was furious. Amara caught his eye. She gave the smallest, most imperceptible shake of her head. Gerald's jaw tightened, but he sat back slightly. Just slightly. "Everybody back against the wall," Marcus said, walking further into the room now. "Medical staff included, against the wall, hands where I can see them. You do that, you cooperate. Nobody gets hurt worse than they already are. He paused. That was a joke. Lighten up. None of the three men laughed. Amara didn't think Marcus actually expected them to. She moved back toward the wall with the other nurses, her shoulder blades finding the painted cinder block, her hands coming up at chest height. She kept her breathing even. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. She had learned that in a place very different from this hospital, under conditions that would have made this waiting room look like a vacation, and the muscle memory of it came back to her the way muscle memory always did. Without fanfare, without announcement, just there like it had never left. Dr. Emil Voss, the attending physician on duty, was standing 3 people to her left. He was 58 years old, had been practicing emergency medicine for 26 years, and had, in Amara's 41 days of working with him, never once appeared rattled by anything. He had calmly intubated a man whose airway was collapsing while a family member screamed in the doorway. He had delivered a baby in a supply closet on a Tuesday. He was one of the steadiest people she had ever observed in a clinical setting. He was shaking now, not violently, but his hands pressed flat against the wall were trembling slightly at the fingertips. "What do you want?" Voss said. His voice was impressively even despite the hands. Marcus turned toward him with the expression of a man pleasantly surprised to be addressed. "The doctor speaks." "Good. I like when people skip the screaming phase. It saves time." He walked a slow arc around the waiting area, the gun loose at his side but pointed generally at the group against the wall. "What I want is simple. I want access to your pharmacy. I want the on-call narcotics safe opened. And I want it done quietly and quickly while my associates make sure none of you get any ideas about being heroes." "The pharmacy is on the 2nd floor, Voss said. "I know where the pharmacy is," Marcus said, "which is why you're going to take me there." One of the nurses beside Amara made a small sound, the involuntary intake of breath that people make when they are trying not to cry. Her name was Patrice. She was 27 and had been at Veterans Memorial for 3 years, and she was one of the nurses who had laughed when Amara's scrubs cart had tipped over in the hallway on her 2nd day. Amara had not held a grudge about that. Patrice had also been the one to bring her a granola bar without being asked when Amara had missed lunch 2 Thursdays ago. Amara turned her head slightly toward Patrice and said very quietly, just above a whisper, "Breathe." Patrice looked at her. Her eyes were wide and very bright. "Slow," Amara said. "Breathe slow." Patrice breathed. It wasn't slow exactly, but it was slower than it had been. Marcus was still talking to Voss, laying out his requirements with the patient specificity of someone who had rehearsed this. The tall man with the red bandana was walking the perimeter of the room, glancing at faces, asserting presence. The third man, shorter, heavier, with a gray hoodie and restless eyes, had stationed himself near the double doors. Amara counted patients. 11 in the waiting area. 3 in exam rooms that she knew of, possibly more she hadn't seen that morning. Gerald in his wheelchair. 2 elderly men seated together near the vending machine, both wearing VFW hats, both watching the men with guns, with the particular quality of attention that Amara recognized, because she had seen it before in other places on the faces of people who were measuring angles and distances. A mother with 2 young children, a teenager with a wrapped ankle from what she guessed was a sports injury, a woman in her 40s who had come in that morning complaining of chest pain and had been waiting for a room. The woman with chest pain had gone pale in a way that worried Amara. Stress was not what she needed. Acute stress on top of potential cardiac symptoms was in fact the last thing she needed. Amara looked at the woman. The woman looked back at her. Amara held up 2 fingers, then pointed at her own chest and raised her eyebrows in a question. The woman seemed to understand. She pressed her own fingers to her sternum and made a so-so gesture with her hand. Amara nodded once. "Hey!" The tall man with the red bandana had stopped in front of her. He was looking at her with narrowed eyes. "What are you doing?" "Checking on a patient," Amara said. "I didn't ask you to do that." "She has cardiac symptoms," Amara said. "If she goes into arrest in this room, it becomes a lot more complicated for everyone." The tall man stared at her for a moment. He was maybe 30, and he had the kind of eyes that wanted to look dangerous, but landed closer to anxious. Amara had seen that combination before too. Anxious people with guns were categorically the worst kind of people with guns, because anxious people made decisions that didn't track logically and couldn't be predicted the same way. "Shut up and stay still," he said. "I'm still," Amara said. "I'm just talking." He moved on. Amara exhaled slowly. The thing that was pressing against her left thigh through the fabric of her two large scrubs was a challenge coin. It was old, the edges had worn smooth over years of handling. One side bore the trident and anchor and eagle of naval special warfare. The other side had a date and a unit designation she no longer shared with people who hadn't earned the right to hear it. She had been carrying it for 12 years. She had carried it through training pipelines that had broken men twice her size through deployments in places she still couldn't name, out loud in casual conversation, through a medical rotation in a forward operating base, where she had held a tourniquet on a man's leg for 40 minutes in the dark while waiting for extract and talked him through every minute of it with a calm she had manufactured from nothing, because manufactured calm was still calm, and he needed calm more than he needed anything else she could give him. She had been a combat medic embedded with SEAL Team 8. She had spent 12 years in environments where the stakes were consistently life and death, and the margin for error was consistently zero. And then she had come home, and she had gotten her nursing certification, and she had taken a job at Veterans Memorial Hospital because she liked taking care of veterans, and she was tired of the weight of the other thing, and she had spent 41 days being the nurse whose scrubs were too big and who apologized for things that weren't her fault. Nobody in this hospital knew what she had been. She had not told anyone, and nothing about her had prompted anyone to ask. She looked at the two old men in the VFW hats. They were still watching her. One of them gave her the faintest, most minimal nod, the kind of nod that meant, "I see you and I am with you," and Amara felt something shift in her chest. Not dramatically, not in a way that showed on her face, just a quiet, steady settling, like a scope finding its zero. Marcus was walking Voss toward the door that led to the stairwell. The tall man followed. The short man in the gray hoodie stayed in the waiting area, gun visible, pacing. "Anyone moves," the short man said to the room. "Anyone at all, I start shooting. Not warning shots. I start with the oldest person in the room and I work my way down." He said it conversationally, like he was reading a menu. "We good?" "Yeah, good." Gerald looked at Amara. Amara looked at Gerald. Gerald's hands had stopped shaking. His jaw was set and his eyes were flat and careful, and he straightened slightly in his wheelchair, which she recognized as a man making himself ready for something, and she gave him the same small head shake she'd given him before. Not yet. His eyes said he understood. His eyes also said there was going to be a yet, and he was going to be there for it. The short man in the hoodie was moving. He walked the room slowly, establishing dominance, touching things. He picked up a clipboard from the nurse's station and dropped it. He kicked over the small plastic wastebasket by the reception desk. Small gestures of control. Amara tracked him with her peripheral vision and kept her expression neutral. The woman with the cardiac symptoms shifted in her seat, pressing back into the plastic chair, hugging herself with both arms. Her color was getting worse. Amara looked at the short man. "Sir," she said. He turned. "That woman needs to lie down. If she doesn't, you are going to have a medical emergency on your hands in about 20 minutes that will bring every paramedic and police officer in the county through those doors, whether you want them or not." He walked toward her. He got close enough that she could smell cigarette smoke and something chemical on his clothes, and he put the gun at his side and looked down at her with the specific contempt of a man who wanted her to be afraid of him. "Say another word," he said, "and I put you on the floor." Amara looked at him steadily. "I understand," she said. "I just want you to understand the situation you'll be managing in about 20 minutes. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he looked at the woman in the chair. The woman was visibly clammy now, her lips parted, her breathing shallow. "Fine," he said. "Do what you need to do, quick." Amara crossed the room to the woman, keeping her movements measured and visible, nothing sudden. She crouched beside the chair. "I'm Amara," she said quietly. "I'm going to take care of you. What's your name?" "Helen," the woman said. Her voice was thin. "Helen, I need you to slide down in this chair. Get your feet up on the armrest here. Can you do that for me?" Amara helped her shift position, got her reclined slightly, and pressed 2 fingers to her wrist. Pulse was fast and irregular. Not ideal. She kept her face calm. "Am I going to be okay?" Helen said. "You're going to be fine," Amara said. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you." She meant it the way she had always meant statements like that, which was completely and without reservation, and which was based not on optimism, but on the firm, quiet certainty that she was not going to allow a different outcome. She had said those words before, in situations that made this look manageable, And she had always, up to this point, kept that promise. She took Helen's hand and squeezed it once, then stood up. And in that moment, from somewhere above them, on the second floor of Veterans Memorial Hospital, came the sound of raised voices, something shattering, and then a single shot. The short man in the hoodie spun toward the ceiling. His gun came up. Patrice made that small, terrible sound again. The two men in the VFW hats were on their feet before anyone realized they had moved, and the short man was swinging his gun back toward them, and Gerald was gripping the wheels of his wheelchair, and the whole room was on the edge of something that was about to go very wrong, very fast. Amara moved. She was between the short man and the two veterans in 2 steps, and she said sharp and clear, and with the kind of authority that didn't require a raised voice, "Stop." Everyone stopped, including for just a second the short man with the gun. He looked at her. The gun was pointed at her chest. His hand was trembling. His eyes were showing too much white. "Lower the gun," she said. Same voice, steady, measured, like she was telling him to lower it because it was the obvious, sensible, logical next action. Like she was not standing 18 inches from a loaded weapon pointed at her sternum. "Whoever is upstairs is handling whatever is happening upstairs. You start shooting down here, you turn a manageable situation into a catastrophe. Is that what Marcus wants? Is that what you want?" He stared at her. "Think," she said. "You're thinking. I can see it. Good. Keep thinking." The gun didn't lower, but it stopped moving. The trembling in his hand slowed by a degree. The sound from upstairs had stopped. Somewhere in the room, Helen was breathing in long, slow pulls, and Amara could hear it, and it sounded against everything else like something good. She kept her eyes on the short man, and her hands visible at her sides, and her feet shoulder-width apart, and she waited with the absolute patience of someone who had learned to be comfortable with extremely uncomfortable silences in extremely dangerous places for whatever came next. The 2 old men in the VFW hats stood behind her, and she did not look at them, and she did not need to. She could feel them there, solid, patient, ready. Gerald's hands rested on his wheels. And somewhere in Amara's left thigh, pressed through the fabric of her 2 large scrubs, the challenge coin was warm from her body heat, carrying 12 years of things nobody in this building knew about her. But it stopped rising, and for Amara, in that particular moment, that was enough. She had learned years ago that there was a specific kind of standoff that had nothing to do with firepower and everything to do with psychology. The short man in the gray hoodie was not a soldier. He was not trained, not disciplined, not operating from a place of cold strategy. He was operating from adrenaline and borrowed courage, and those 2 things had a shelf life, and she could see the expiration date approaching in real time behind his eyes. "You need to make a decision," she said, keeping her voice level. "You shoot me, you have 11 witnesses, 2 of whom are veterans with nothing to lose. You don't shoot me, we all stay calm, and you walk out of here when Marcus gets what he came for. That's the math. That's the only math that matters right now." He breathed hard through his nose. The gun wavered. "Put it down," she said. "Not on the floor, just down, at your side. You're still in control. That doesn't change." He lowered it, not all the way, but enough that it was no longer pointed at her chest, and the 2 men in the VFW hats exhaled almost simultaneously, and Patrice made a sound that was half sob and half relief, and Gerald's hands finally relaxed on his wheels. Amara turned back to Helen because turning her back on the short man was a deliberate move, a statement that said she had already moved past the moment he had created, and he could follow or not, and most people, when given the option of following or being left behind, followed. She heard his footsteps resume their pacing behind her. He was following. Helen's pulse had steadied, slightly still fast, but more regular. Amara smoothed the back of her hand once across Helen's forehead and felt the clamminess there, but also a slight cooling which was better than the alternative. "You're doing great," she said quietly. "I don't feel like I'm doing great," Helen said. "You are. Stay with me." The sound from upstairs had not come back. Whatever had happened on the second floor was either resolved or had moved to a quieter phase, and neither of those possibilities was necessarily good, but Amara was managing what was in front of her, and the second floor would announce itself when it was ready. One of the men in the VFW hats had sat back down, but the other one was still standing. He was tall, with a white mustache, and the kind of build that said he had once been significantly larger, and time had trimmed him down, but not diminished him. He looked at Amara with the steady, appraising attention she was starting to recognize, as something that ran deep in a specific kind of person, the kind of person who had spent years in situations where reading people correctly was the difference between going home and not. "You doing all right, miss?" he said. His voice was quiet enough that only Amara and the nearest two people could hear it. "I'm fine," she said. "Sit down, please. I'm comfortable standing." "I know. Sit down anyway. For me." He looked at her for another moment, then sat slowly, keeping his back straight. He did not look away from the short man's position. From somewhere deep in the hospital, an alarm began sounding. Not the main emergency alarm, a quieter one, something internal, the kind that went off when a monitored patient's vitals crossed a threshold. Amara knew that sound. She had heard it dozens of times in 41 days. It meant someone in one of the back exam rooms was in distress. The short man stopped pacing. "What is that patient alarm?" Amara said. "Probably one of the people in the exam rooms. I need to check it." "You're not going anywhere. If I don't check it, that patient could code. And then you have a body on your hands instead of a hostage situation, and those are two very different conversations with law enforcement." She held his gaze. "Let me check it. I'll be in the room directly through that door. You can see the door from where you are standing." He chewed the inside of his cheek. 2 minutes, he said. Amara moved. The exam room was room 3, which she had passed a dozen times that morning. Inside was a man named Thomas Breckwith, 71 years old, Army infantry, Vietnam era, who had come in that morning complaining of dizziness and had been placed on a cardiac monitor while they waited for his blood work. The monitor was showing an arrhythmia that was irregular enough to warrant attention and not irregular enough yet to be immediately catastrophic. Thomas was sitting up on the exam table, which was the wrong position for what his monitor was showing. He looked at her when she came in and said, "What the hell is going on out there?" "Some men came in with guns," Amara said, moving to the monitor, checking his leads, making sure nothing had come loose. "I need you to lie back for me, Mr. Breckwith." "I heard a shot." "I know. Lie back." "Are people hurt?" "Not yet," she said. "Lie back and breathe." "I mean it. Your heart is doing something I don't like." He lay back. He was the kind of man who argued about everything until someone told him something was medically necessary, and then he became instantly cooperative, which was a personality type Amara had come to deeply appreciate in the last 41 days. "Is anyone handling it?" he said, staring at the ceiling tiles. "Someone's got to be handling it." "Someone's handling it," she said. He turned his head and looked at her. She was adjusting his monitor leads, her hands efficient and certain, and something in his expression shifted slightly. Something that had been tense becoming fractionally less so. "You don't seem scared," he said. "I'm managing," she said. "There's a difference," he said. "I see," she said. "There is." She checked his vitals one more time, verified that the rhythm, while abnormal, was not an immediate free fall, and said, "I'm going to need you to stay in this room no matter what you hear. Do not come out. Can you do that for me?" "I'm not exactly running anywhere," Thomas said, gesturing at the leads attached to him. "Good, I'll be back." She squeezed his hand once quickly and walked out. The short man was exactly where she had left him, positioned with sightlines on both the door and the main group against the wall. He watched her return without comment, which she took as a small, useful victory. Every time he chose silence over confrontation, they were building a working pattern. Patterns could be used. Patrice was crying now. Silently, tears running straight down her face, her chin trembling. The nurse beside her, an older woman named Glenda, who had been at the hospital for 20 years and had the posture of someone who had seen everything, had put an arm around Patrice's shoulders without a word. Amara caught Patrice's eye. She put 2 fingers to her own sternum, the same gesture she had used with Helen, and raised her eyebrows. Patrice blinked, confused for a second, and then seemed to understand and drew a long, shaking breath, and her shoulders dropped a half inch, and that was something. Then the stairwell door opened. Marcus came through, first moving backward, which was strange enough that every head in the room turned. Behind him, walking fast, jaw set, face tight with the specific anger of a man who had been pushed further than he intended to go, was Dr. Voss. Behind Voss was the tall man with the red bandana, and behind him, walking with a slight hitch in his step, was a 4th man Amara hadn't seen before, shorter than the others, with a shaved head and a bruised face that suggested someone had recently introduced him to a hard surface. None of that was what held Amara's attention. What held her attention was the man the tall one was pushing through the door ahead of him, A large man, probably 6'2" broad in the shoulders, with close-cropped, gray hair and the kind of hands that came from physical work, and a face that was currently expressing nothing at all, the specific nothing that trained people wore when they were conserving everything for what came next. He was in a hospital gown and socks, which meant he had been pulled from a room upstairs and he had his hands up, but he was holding them with his elbows bent and angled forward, not the submissive raised hands posture of a frightened civilian, but the ready position of someone whose hands were currently up because he had made a tactical decision that up was correct for now. Amara recognized that posture the way she recognized her own reflection. The tall man shoved him forward. "Got a problem upstairs," he said to Marcus. This one locked the pharmacy office and put himself in front of the door. Took Renner 3 minutes to get it open. Marcus turned. He looked at the large man in the hospital gown. "You a doctor," he said. "Patient," the large man said. His voice was deep and entirely without inflection. "Patient," Marcus repeated. He looked him over. "What kind of patient throws a crash cart through a window?" "One who had options," the large man said. Something flickered in Marcus's expression, something between amusement and recalibration. "You got a name?" "Delroy," the man said. "Ray Delroy." Amara knew that name. She knew it the way you knew names that appeared on documents with seals and commendations and after-action reports. Gunnery Sergeant Ray Delroy, retired Marine. 3 tours in Fallujah and 2 in Helmand. She had never met him, but she had been briefed alongside people who had served beside him once in a joint operation context, and his name had been spoken in a room full of people who did not say names like that casually. She kept her face still. "Ray Delroy," Marcus said again, tasting the name. "Doesn't mean anything to me." "I know," Delroy said. "That's fine." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the tall man. "Put him with the others. If he moves, break something of his." The tall man walked Delroy to the wall. Delroy moved without resistance, without performance, with the unsettling patience of a man who was extremely clear on when his moment would be and was content to wait for it. He took a position against the wall and his eyes moved across the room in one long, deliberate sweep, and when they reached Amara, they stopped. She looked back at him. His gaze dropped almost imperceptibly to her left leg, to the faint rectangular outline visible through the fabric of her 2 large scrubs, and then back to her face. And something in his expression changed so minimally that no one else in the room would have seen it, but Amara saw it because she was looking for it, and what she thought was recognition. She gave him nothing back. Not yet. Marcus was now in full command of the room, pacing with the energy of someone who had completed a phase of his plan and was moving to the next. Dr. Voss was beside him, visibly depleted, the steadiness that had served him earlier ground down by whatever had happened upstairs. The 4th man, Renner, the one with the bruised face, was standing slightly apart from the others and watching the room with eyes that were different from the others, faster, more analytical, and that made him the one Amara filed away as most dangerous. "All right," Marcus said to the room. "Good news and better news. Good news is we got what we came for. Better news is we're almost done here. We stay quiet for about 20 more minutes while my colleagues finish outside, and then we walk and you all go home and tell your families about the most exciting Tuesday of your lives." He paused. "The pharmacy cooperated. Nobody needs to get hurt. We're past that." "You shot someone on the way in," Glenda said. The room went very quiet. Marcus turned toward the voice with the slow deliberateness of a man who had just heard something he was choosing how to respond to. Glenda was 63 years old, had gray hair pinned back severely, and was looking at Marcus with the expression of a woman who had spent decades cleaning up messes left by other people and was deeply personally tired of it. "Excuse me," Marcus said. "You shot someone in the hallway on your way in," Glenda said. "I heard 2 shots. That means someone is lying in a hallway somewhere in this building without medical attention. And if you want everyone to stay calm and cooperative for 20 minutes, then you need to let one of us go check on that person." Marcus stared at her. "You always talk to armed men like that." "I talk to everyone like this," Glenda said. "I've been a nurse here since before you were born." Something happened in the room in that moment that was hard to describe but was entirely real. The energy shifted. A few of the patients straightened slightly. Patrice stopped crying. Even Helen, lying reclined in her chair, turned her head toward Glenda's voice with something that looked like gratitude. There was a specific kind of courage that was not physical, not tactical, not the calculated courage of someone with 12 years of training behind them, but the simple, stubborn, immovable courage of a person who had decided that some things simply needed to be said, regardless of the consequences. And that kind of courage in Amara's experience was frequently more disarming than anything else in the room. Marcus looked at Glenda for a long time. Then he looked at Renner. Renner said quietly, "Let the woman check. We don't need a body." Marcus made a small dismissive gesture with his hand. "Fine. One person, 2 minutes, and Renner goes with you." Glenda looked at Amara. "Come with me," she said. Marcus said, "I said one person." "She's the most capable medical staff in this room," Glenda said. "You want it done right, you send the right person." Amara did not look at Marcus. She looked at Glenda. Glenda met her eyes with the calm authority of a woman handing off something important. "Fine," Marcus said. 2 minutes. Renner, you're with them." Renner crossed the room and opened the door to the corridor, and Glenda walked through it, and Amara followed, and Renner came behind with one hand near his jacket and his eyes moving the way trained eyes moved in a pattern rather than randomly. And Amara noted the pattern and noted the hand position and noted that he was left dominant based on which side he favored and followed all of it without breaking her stride. The corridor was dim. The overhead fluorescence had that particular hospital quality of being simultaneously too bright and not quite right, and the sound of their footsteps on the linoleum was the only sound because the hospital had gone eerily completely quiet. The man was near the main entrance, which was now barricaded with a cart someone had pushed across the doors. He was in his late 30s in civilian clothes, probably a visitor rather than staff. He was conscious, barely propped against the wall with one hand pressed hard against his left shoulder and the other hand flat on the floor. There was a lot of blood. He looked up at them with the dazed, glassy focus of someone whose body was doing everything it could to keep the available blood directed toward the organs that needed it most. "We're nurses," Amara said, dropping beside him. "I've got you." She pressed both hands over his, over the wound, applying compression with the automatic certainty of someone for whom this was not a new situation. The man winced sharply. "It went through," she said to Glenda. "Through and through to the shoulder, probably missed the subclavian. He's losing blood, but not at the rate that would mean arterial." "Glenda, I need your jacket." Glenda was already removing it. Renner stood 2 feet back watching. His expression gave nothing away. Amara packed the wound with Glenda's jacket, maintaining pressure, talking to the man steadily and quietly the same way she had once talked to a different man in a dark forward operating base, waiting for a helicopter that was running late. "What's your name?" "Kevin," the man said. His voice was thin and effortful. "Kevin, stay with me. I've got you." "Am I going to—" "No," she said before he finished. "You're not. Breathe." She could feel Renner behind her. She could feel him watching her hands. "You're good at this," he said. She did not answer. "I mean it," he said. "Better than a regular nurse." She kept her hands where they were and her eyes on Kevin, and she said nothing at all, and the silence was its own answer, and she felt rather than saw Renner's expression change slightly as he processed what that silence meant. "Huh," he said quietly, mostly to himself. Kevin's breathing steadied under her hands. She had bought him time. How much depended on what came next and how quickly it came. She looked at Glenda over Kevin's head, and Glenda looked back at her with the expression of a woman who understood the situation exactly and was prepared to do her part of whatever needed to happen. They walked back to the waiting area with Renner behind them, and Marcus looked at them when they came through the door, and Amara said, "He needs a surgical team within the hour or the outcome changes." "He'll get one," Marcus said. "Your word," she said. Marcus looked at her. "You're not in a position to ask for my word." "No," she said, "but I'm asking anyway." He held her gaze for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then he said, "He'll be fine. An hour is plenty." She nodded once and moved back to her position against the wall. Delroy was watching her. She settled against the wall beside him without planning to the movement natural enough that the tall man did not react. Delroy was looking straight ahead. Without turning, without any change in his expression, he said very quietly beneath the ambient sound of the room, "Cobra." Amara felt the word hit her somewhere between her rib cage and her sternum. It was a call sign. Specifically, it was a call sign that had been used in exactly one operational context, in exactly one briefing room by exactly 2 people who had been in that room, and one of them was standing next to her right now. She said nothing. I thought I recognized the coin, Delroy said. Same quiet, same forward gaze. Through the scrubs. After a moment, she said just as quietly, you shouldn't have come out of your room. Probably not, he said, but I wasn't going to let them walk into that pharmacy without making it complicated. You made it complicated for yourself. Story of my career, Delroy said. She almost smiled. She stopped it before it reached her face. Are you hurt? Bruised ribs were Renner's friend introduced me to a cabinet. Nothing structural. Good, she paused. How many men does Marcus have outside? Delroy was quiet for 2 seconds. 3 that I counted from the window before they pulled me back. 1 at the main entrance, 2 on the south side, probably more I didn't see. Police. Not yet when I was at the window, but it's been long enough. She thought about that, 20 minutes Marcus had said, which meant he expected an extraction window of some kind, which meant he had a plan beyond walking out the front door, which meant the calculation on when to move was not when she felt ready, but when his window was about to close. When, Delroy said, reading the silence. She said quietly, when I tell you. He nodded once, barely a movement. Against the wall to her left, Patrice had stopped crying. Gerald sat with his hands quiet on his wheels. The 2 men in the VFW hats sat with their backs straight and their eyes open. Glenda had returned to her position beside the other nurses, and her face was set with the same expression she'd worn when she'd spoken to Marcus, flat and immovable and entirely unintimidated. Marcus was on a phone call in the corner speaking in a low voice. The tall man was watching the room. Renner was watching Amara. The short man was by the door and his pacing had slowed, and the adrenaline that had been sustaining him was visibly metabolizing into something closer to exhaustion. Amara stood against the wall, her hands at her sides, her breathing even and slow, her weight distributed carefully between both feet, and she looked like a nurse in scrubs that were slightly too large, and she felt the coin against her thigh warm and worn smooth at the edges. She thought about 12 years. She thought about forward positions and dark extracts in a specific kind of calm that you could only build by being tested somewhere beyond the edge of ordinary limits. She thought about 41 days of apologizing for things that weren't her fault. She thought about a man named Kevin bleeding against a wall in a hallway, and a woman named Helen with her feet up in a plastic chair, and Thomas Breckwith lying back in room 3, staring at ceiling tiles, and Gerald with his jaw set, and Delroy standing next to her with bruised ribs and the patience of someone who had been in far worse rooms than this. Renner was still watching her. She looked back at him steady and quiet, and what she gave him back was the same stillness she had carried into every moment since she had heard the first shot, the kind of stillness that was not the absence of action, but its precise opposite. Amara knew this because she had been counting. Not obsessively, not in the way that anxiety counted, but the way a person counted when they were building a map of a room in their head and time was one of its dimensions. 11 minutes since they had come back from the corridor. 11 minutes of Renner standing slightly apart from the others with his arms crossed and his eyes doing that analytical sweep that kept returning to her, a pattern inside a pattern, and each time it returned, it stayed a half-second longer. He knew something. He did not know what he knew. That gap was useful, and it was also narrowing, and Amara was aware of both. Marcus finished his phone call and pocketed the phone and walked to the center of the room. He looked at his watch, an old habit, the kind of man who checked an analog watch rather than a phone. 8 minutes, he said to no one in particular, which meant he was talking to his crew. 8 minutes and we move. Move where? Gerald said. Marcus looked at him with the patient exasperation of a man who kept being surprised that people kept talking. You don't need to know that. You're going out the service exit, Gerald said. South side, the loading dock. That's where you've got people, and that's the only exit you can reach before the police lock the perimeter. The room went very quiet. Marcus walked toward Gerald slowly. Old man, he said, I strongly advise you to stop talking. I was an infantryman for 22 years, Gerald said. I've been advised by better than you. The short man by the door straightened. The tall man moved 2 steps closer. Renner uncrossed his arms. Amara stepped forward. She did not step between Marcus and Gerald the way she had stepped between the short man and the veterans earlier. She stepped to the side into Marcus's peripheral field, close enough to redirect his attention without placing herself directly in his path, which was a different geometry for a different purpose. He's medicated, she said. He has a hip replacement, and they adjusted his pain management this morning, and it affects his filter. He doesn't mean anything by it. Gerald looked at her. His expression said several things simultaneously, none of them agreeable with her characterization. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second, putting everything she needed to say into that second. He closed his mouth. Marcus looked at her, then at Gerald, then back at her. "Keep him quiet," he said. "Yes," she said. Marcus turned away. Amara exhaled once through her nose and moved back to her position beside Delroy. "Nice," Delroy said so quietly she almost didn't catch it. "He was going to get himself hurt," she said, equally quiet. "Probably, he's always been like that." She glanced at him. "You know him?" "Ray Delroy," Gerald said from his wheelchair, not quietly at all, looking straight ahead with studied innocence. "You old Marine, I wondered when you were going to say something." Delroy looked at the ceiling, briefly, with the expression of a man reconsidering his tactical decisions. The short man by the door turned toward them. "Hey, no talking." "We're not talking," Gerald said. "We're whispering. There's a difference." The short man took a step toward them. "Hey," Amara said, sharp enough to turn his attention. "He's fine. I've got him." The short man stopped and looked at her and then did the thing she had been carefully engineering over the last 40 minutes, which was to defer because they had built enough of a pattern. Now that deference was the path of least resistance, and he was tired and his adrenaline was gone, and the path of least resistance was where exhausted people went. He turned back to the door. Amara did not feel relief. She felt the clock. 8 minutes, Marcus had said. That was 5 minutes ago. She had 3 minutes, give or take, and she needed to know 2 things before she moved where Renner was going to be, and what the fourth man, the one with the bruised face who had been quiet in the corner since they came downstairs, was going to do when the situation changed. She looked at the fourth man. He was seated now, which was new. He had his elbows on his knees and his head slightly down, and he was sweating in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She had been peripherally aware of him deteriorating for the last 20 minutes and had categorized it and set it aside because he had seemed the least aggressive of the group and therefore the lowest priority. But deterioration in an armed person was not a stable state, and she revised that assessment now. His name was Renner's friend. Renner had used that word friend upstairs with Marcus, and the way he had said it carried the weight of actual relationship, not professional affiliation. And Renner had a bruised face that matched the fourth man's bruised face in symmetry, if not in origin, which meant they had been in the same place recently where faces got bruised, which told her things about their history and the nature of their connection. She looked at Renner. Renner was looking at the fourth man with the expression of someone monitoring a situation they did not entirely trust. She moved, not dramatically. She walked across the room with the specific casual purpose of a nurse doing a job, which was a thing she had discovered in the last 40 minutes, was among the most effective movement disguises available, because it was expected and non-threatening, and people's eyes tracked it and then released it. She crossed to the station on the far side, opened a drawer, took out a blood pressure cuff, and turned back toward the fourth man. "Sir," she said, walking toward him, "I need to check on you." He looked up. His eyes were not tracking well. "I'm fine," he said. "You don't look fine." She pulled a chair in front of him and sat down. She wrapped the cuff around his arm with the efficiency of long practice, and while she did, she was also doing something else entirely, which was positioning herself in relation to the room. The short man was at the door. The tall man was at the far wall. Marcus was near the stairwell. Renner was 6 feet to her left. "Your heart rate is elevated," she said, which was true. The fourth man looked at Renner. "She always talked this much." "Let her do her job," Renner said. The blood pressure reading was genuinely alarming. "What medications are you on?" she said. He shook his head. "I'm not asking to be nosy. If you're on anything that interacts with stress response, I need to know." She kept her voice clinical, warm enough to not alarm him, detached enough to signal professional focus. "Nothing," he said, "then some stuff for my back." "What kind, com?" He said the name. She recognized it immediately and revised her assessment of him again sharply, because that particular medication in combination with the physiological stress he was visibly under was a combination that could produce rapid and unpredictable changes in behavior, specifically a crash of the kind that made people dangerous in the way that cornered animals were dangerous. She looked at Renner. She kept her expression neutral, but she let her eyes say what they were saying, and Renner was smart enough to read it, and she watched him read it. "Marcus," Renner said. Marcus turned. "We need to move up the timeline." We've got 2 minutes. Now is better, Renner said. Amara stood up. She moved back toward Delroy's position, which took her past the nurse's station, and as she passed the station, she did something that took under a second and was invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically watching her hands, which were at her sides. Delroy was watching her hands. She settled beside him, and he said nothing, and she said nothing, and the coin pressed against her thigh, and she thought now. Not out loud, just in the clean, cold, uncluttered space in the center of her, where decisions lived when everything else had been cleared away. She had stood in that space before, in different rooms, on different ground, with different people depending on her, and the space always felt exactly like this, like the moment before a jump, weightless and absolutely certain. Marcus moved toward the stairwell door. "Let's go," he said. "Tall, take the doctor. We're using the service exit." The tall man moved toward Voss, and then Gerald's wheelchair shot forward, not toward Marcus, not toward any of the gunmen, directly into the path of the tall man, fast enough that the tall man had to sidestep sharply to avoid it, and that sidestep took him off his line, and his gun hand came up and away from Voss, and Gerald said loudly and clearly, "Oops," with the complete insincerity of a man who had absolutely done that on purpose. The tall man grabbed Gerald's chair. "You did that on purpose." "I have a hip replacement," Gerald said. "I have very poor motor control." The tall man raised his gun. Amara was already moving. She crossed the 6 feet between herself and the tall man in a straight line, and at an angle that kept her out of his direct sight until she was inside his arm's reach. And she took his wrist with both hands in the specific grip she had been taught in a very different context and applied the very specific rotational force that went with it. And the gun left his hand and hit the floor, and he made a sound that was part surprise and part pain and came down after it because his wrist had no other choice. 3 seconds, the room exploded. Patrice screamed. Helen sat upright in her chair. The short man by the door turned and raised his gun toward the group, and one of the VFW veterans, the tall one with the white mustache, moved from his chair with a speed that should not have been available to a man of his age and tackled him low, and the gun went up and fired into the ceiling, a deafening crack that showered plaster dust and made every person in the room flinch, and they went down together in a tangle of limbs, and the gun skidded under a chair. The tall man was on the floor cradling his wrist, and Amara had his gun, and she had it up in a two-handed grip that was natural and certain, and not remotely like the way a nurse held a gun, and she was pointing it at Marcus. Marcus had his gun up, pointing at her. Renner had not moved. His hand was inside his jacket, but not out. He was watching her with the expression of a man doing very rapid arithmetic. The fourth man was on his feet, wild-eyed, looking between Marcus and Amara and the door. Delroy had moved to the side of the room where the patients were clustered, placing himself between the patients and the remaining guns because Delroy was Delroy, and that was where Delroy went. The second VFW veteran had his foot on the short man's gun, the one that had skidded under the chair, and was leaning down to pick it up with the calm of a man collecting something he had dropped. Gerald sat in his wheelchair with his hands in his lap and the expression of a man who had thoroughly enjoyed himself. "Put it down," Marcus said. His voice had lost the conversational ease. Something real had come into it, something that was not performance. "You don't want to do this." "I've done harder things than this," Amara said. "You're a nurse." "I am a nurse," she said. "Put the gun down, Marcus." "Who are you?" he said. "Someone who is giving you one chance to end this without anyone dying. The police are outside. Your window is gone. Your extraction is not coming." She kept the gun level. Her hands were completely still. "You can walk out of here in handcuffs, or you can make a different choice, and I strongly recommend the handcuffs." The fourth man bolted for the door. He didn't make it. The second VFW veteran who had retrieved the gun from the floor was smaller than he looked seated, but he moved decisively, and the fourth man's exit was interrupted by a collision that sent him stumbling into the doorframe, and then down to his knees, and the veteran stood over him with the retrieved gun and said in the voice of a man who had given orders professionally for many years, "Stay down." The fourth man stayed down. Marcus looked at the room. He looked at his crew. The tall man on the floor with his wrist. The short man pinned by the other veteran. Renner still with his hand inside his jacket and his eyes doing arithmetic. The fourth man on his knees at the door. He looked at Amara. Amara looked back at him and she was completely still, and the gun did not move, and the only thing she said was, "It's over." Marcus looked at her for a long time, long enough that the room held its breath collectively. Then he said to Renner, "You saw this?" Renner said, "I did." "How?" Renner said nothing for a moment. Then slowly he took his hand out of his jacket and held both hands up and said to Amara, "I'm not pointing anything at anyone." "I know," she said. "I'd like to keep it that way," he said. She said, "That's a good decision." Marcus lowered his gun, not to the floor, to his side. His jaw was tight and his eyes were flat, and the smile that had been with him since he walked through the double doors was gone. What was left was the face of a man making a calculation about things that were beyond this room, beyond this moment, and Amara watched him arrive at the end of that calculation with the patience of someone who had all the time she needed because she had the gun. He put it on the floor. He kicked it toward her. He put his hands up. And from outside the building, from multiple directions at once, came the sound that Amara had been waiting for since the first shot, which was the sound of police vehicles, several of them converging, and the crackle of a bullhorn beginning to speak. Patrice was crying again, but this time the sound was completely different. Glenda had her arms around two of the younger nurses and was talking quietly to them, her voice the level practiced voice of a woman who had navigated crisis before and knew the difference between during and after and was already helping people cross from one to the other. Helen was on her feet. She was pale and shaking, but she was standing on her own, and when Amara's eyes found her across the room, she pressed her hand to her chest and nodded a small, complete gesture that said, "I'm all right and thank you, and I know what you just did, and I don't have words for it, but I need you to know I saw it." Amara nodded back. Gerald rolled his wheelchair forward until he was beside her. He looked at Marcus sitting on the floor with his hands laced behind his head. He looked at the tall man, he looked at the whole arrangement of it, and then he looked at Amara and he said simply and without elaboration, 41 days. 41 days, she said. He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, in something more like wonder. Delroy appeared at her shoulder. He had removed himself from between the patients and the room's center, now that the room's center was no longer dangerous, and he stood beside her with the easy posture of a man who had been in a lot of rooms that had looked like this at the end. Guns on the floor, and everyone breathing, and the particular quality of silence that wasn't quiet at all but was full of everything that had just happened. "Cobra," he said and stopped. She looked at him. He started again. "Where did you serve him?" "8, she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I worked with 8, Kandahar 2014. "I wasn't there in 2014. "No," he said, "but people talked about you." She looked at him steadily. She did not know what to do with that, so she did what she did with most things she did not know what to do with, which was to set it aside and deal with the present moment. Renner was sitting on the floor with his hands visible, and his expression the expression of a man who had just watched something he needed time to process. The short man was still pinned, though the veteran sitting on him had eased up slightly, now that it seemed unnecessary to keep him entirely compressed. The fourth man was in the doorway with his forehead against the frame. The bullhorn outside was giving instructions that nobody in the room needed to hear, because the room had already arrived at the outcome the bullhorn was asking for. Voss was against the wall, not because anyone had told him to be, but because his legs had finally registered what the rest of him had been feeling for the last 40 minutes and had made a unilateral decision about standing. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, and he put his head back against the cinder block, and he closed his eyes, and from across the room, Amara could see his hands finally stop shaking. "Dr. Voss," she said. He opened his eyes. He looked at her across the room at the gun she was still holding at Marcus on the floor at Gerald, in his wheelchair at Delroy beside her, at the whole impossible real finish thing in front of him. "You need to give a statement to the FBI about Kevin," she said. "The man in the hallway. He needs to be their first medical priority when they come in." Voss looked at her for a moment. Then he said with the exhausted, genuine bewilderment of a man who had been her attending physician for 41 days and was only now understanding what that meant, "Who are you?" She held the gun steady and she kept her eyes on the room and she said, "I'm the nurse on duty." And for the first time since the first shot had echoed down the corridor that morning, for the first time since Marcus Devlin had walked through those double doors with his smile and his gun, she let something happen in her face. Not a smile exactly. Something quieter than that and harder to name the particular expression of a person who has carried something for a long time in a space no one could see and has just finally been seen. The front doors came open, the room filled with the voices and movement of people arriving to do what needed to be done, and Amara stood in the middle of it still, and certain the way she had stood in harder places than this, and she waited for them to come to her because she was done going anywhere. The first FBI agent through the door was a woman which Amara noticed and noted and then set aside because it was not relevant to anything except that it was the kind of detail her brain cataloged without being asked. The agent was in her 40s, dark jacket eyes, moving fast across the room in the professional sweep that Amara recognized as trained assessment rather than panic response. She had her weapon up and then down in about 2 seconds, reading the room correctly, reading the guns on the floor, and Marcus with his hands behind his head in the arrangement of everything. "Federal agents," the woman said loudly, clearly. "Everyone stay where you are. If you are holding a weapon, place it on the floor now." Amara set the gun on the floor and stepped back from it and raised both hands. She did this before anyone told her to do it twice because the last thing a room full of incoming law enforcement needed was ambiguity about who had done what, and she had enough experience with rapid entry situations to know that the seconds immediately following entry were when mistakes happened. Delroy did the same thing beside her. The VFW veteran with the recovered gun placed it on the floor. The second veteran released the short man and stood with his hands up. 3 more agents came in through the door behind the first, and then 2 uniformed officers, and then 2 more agents, and the room that had been so rigidly controlled by Marcus Devlin for the better part of an hour became a controlled chaos of an entirely different kind, full of voices giving instructions and people responding to them in the particular organized urgency of professionals doing what they had trained for. Marcus was cuffed first, then the tall man who made a pained sound when they pulled his wrist behind his back. The short man, the 4th man from the doorway. Renner put his hands out in front of him before anyone touched him and said clearly, "I'm cooperating fully," and the agent who cuffed him acknowledged it with a nod. The first agent, the one who had come through first, walked directly to Amara. "Are you staff here?" she said. "Nursing staff," Amara said. "Amara Mensa. I've been the primary contact point for the hostages for the duration." The agent looked at the gun on the floor, then at Amara. "That yours?" "I took it from one of the intruders. I secured the room until you arrived." The agent processed this with the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned not to express surprise professionally. "I'm going to need a full statement. Are you injured?" "No." "Anyone in here need immediate medical?" "Helen Marsh, possible cardiac event. She's in the chair to your left. She needs a proper evaluation before anyone moves her." "Kevin, last name unknown, gunshot wound to the shoulder. He's in the main corridor near the front entrance. Through and through wound was packed. He needs surgical consult within the next 30 minutes. Amara paused. "Thomas Breckwith in exam room 3 cardiac monitoring. He needs his physician to review his strip from the last hour. And Dr. Voss on the floor by the east wall needs water and probably 20 minutes before he can give a coherent statement." The agent was writing. She stopped writing and looked up. "You cataloged all of that." "It's my job," Amara said. The agent looked at her for one more second in a way that was not quite the way people usually looked at nurses. Then she turned and started giving her own instructions to her team, and Amara lowered her hands and turned to find Gerald directly behind her. "Kevin is the man from the hallway," Gerald said. "The one you went to." "Yes." "Is he going to make it?" "If they move fast, which they will." Gerald nodded slowly. He looked at the room, at the agents processing the scene, at Marcus being walked toward the doors, at the patients beginning to stand and move and talk to each other in the way that people did when the pressure lifted. He looked at the 2 VFW veterans who were being spoken to by a uniformed officer and who were both gesturing at various points in the room with the animated precision of men giving tactical reports, which was essentially what they were doing. "I have to ask you something," Gerald said. "You can ask. Were you scared at any point in there? Any of it?" She thought about it honestly. Not the diplomatic answer, not the modest answer, the true answer. "For Helen," she said, "when her color went, that scared me because that one I couldn't control with training." Gerald was quiet for a moment. The rest of it I had tools for," she said. He nodded. He reached up and took something off the lapel of his hospital gown and held it out. It was a pin small and worn the globe and anchor of the Marine Corps. "I've been wearing that since 1974, he said. "I want you to have it." She looked at it in his palm. She did not take it immediately. "Gerald, that's yours." "I know whose it is," he said. "I'm giving it to you." She took it. It was lighter than she expected. She closed her fingers around it, and it was warm from his body, and she said very quietly, "Thank you," and meant it the way she had not expected to mean it. He waved the sentiment away with the brisk efficiency of a man who did not traffic in prolonged emotion. "Go do your job," he said. "They need you." She went. The next 40 minutes were the controlled intensity of aftermath, which in Amara's experience was in some ways harder than the event itself because during the event, there was a clarity of purpose that aftermath did not provide. During aftermath, everything happened at once, and the hierarchy of urgency was less obvious, and the adrenaline was metabolizing, and people who had held themselves together during the crisis were now beginning to feel what they had not let themselves feel before. Patrice was one of them. Amara found her in the corner of the waiting area, sitting on the floor with her knees up her back against the wall, her face in her hands. Not crying, past crying. The specific stillness of someone who had run out of a particular resource and hadn't yet refilled it. Amara sat down beside her on the floor, which was not a thing she would normally do in a clinical environment, but this was not a normal clinical moment. She didn't say anything for a moment. Patrice said from behind her hands, "I froze." "I know," Amara said. "I just completely froze. The whole time, I didn't do anything." "You breathed when I told you to," Amara said. "That wasn't nothing." Patrice lowered her hands. Her face was blotched and exhausted. "That's not the same as what you did." "No," Amara agreed. "It's different, but it's not nothing." Keeping yourself from panic kept the room calmer. Calm rooms don't make sudden movements. Sudden movements were what I was managing against. You helped. Patrice looked at her. "Did you make that up to make me feel better?" "I don't make things up," Amara said. Patrice was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I laughed at your scrub cart on your second day when it tipped over." "I know. I feel bad about that." "Don't," Amara said. "It was funny." Patrice made a sound that was the first cousin of a laugh, not quite there but close, and Amara took that as a good sign and stood up offering a hand down, and Patrice took it and got to her feet. Glenda appeared from somewhere with 2 cups of water, the hospital paper kind, and handed one to each of them with the no-ceremony efficiency of a woman distributing necessary resources. "Helen is with the paramedics," she said to Amara. "She specifically asked me to tell you she's okay." "Good," Amara said. "She also asked me to get your last name so she can send you something. I told her I'd pass along the request." "Mensa," Amara said. MENSAH. Glenda nodded and moved on, already doing the next thing on a list that existed only in her head, and which she was working through with the methodical focus that Amara had come to recognize as Glenda's baseline mode of operating. The FBI agent appeared again. She had finished the initial processing of the room and was moving into the statement gathering phase. And she had a second agent with her, now younger male, the kind of young that made Amara privately recalibrate his competence upward because the people she had been trained alongside who looked that young had frequently been the most dangerous people in the room. "Ms. Mensa," the first agent peered, "I'd like to start your statement when you have a moment." "I have one now," Amara said. They moved to the far side of the room away from the main activity, and Amara gave her statement with the organized precision of someone reporting after an operation, which was not how civilians gave statements. And both agents noted this, and the younger one wrote faster as the statement went on, and his handwriting got smaller and more compressed, which she recognized as the behavior of someone who had started writing, expecting one thing, and was now writing something they hadn't anticipated. She told them everything except the coin and the call sign and what Delroy had said to her. Those were not relevant to the crime. They were relevant to other things that belonged to a different context than a formal federal statement. When she finished, the first agent said, "Ms. Mensa, the weapon you recovered, your technique for disarming the suspect, your behavior throughout. I want to ask you directly, and I'd appreciate a direct answer." She paused. "What is your background?" Amara looked at her steadily. "Combat medic," she said. "SEAL Team 8, 12 years." The younger agent's pen stopped moving. The first agent held her gaze. "You didn't think to mention that at the outset." No one asked, Amara said. Do your employers know? It's in my application file, she said. Whether anyone read it is a different question. The first agent made a note. We're going to need to follow up. I understand, Amara said. She left them and went to check on Thomas Breckwith in exam room 3, who had followed her instructions and stayed exactly where she had left him, and was currently lying on the exam table staring at the ceiling with the expression of a man who had spent the last hour listening to things he couldn't see and had opinions about that. You came back, he said. I said I would. I heard shooting, he said, more than once. Yes. And a lot of shouting and then more shooting and then what sounded like a pretty significant collision. That was the VFW gentleman in the waiting area, she said. They were helpful. Thomas looked at her. He had the eyes of a man who had spent a lifetime reading people in situations where misreading them was not survivable, and what those eyes were doing right now was adding up a column of numbers that had been accumulating since she had walked into his room an hour ago with calm hands and told him she had it handled. You're not just a nurse, he said. I'm absolutely a nurse, she said. I'm checking your rhythm strip now. She looked at the monitor. The arrhythmia had settled into something irregular but less acutely concerning, stress response, fading as the auditory evidence of the situation outside had resolved. She adjusted his position, slightly noted his vitals, and flagged his chart for the attending cardiologist with specific annotations that would tell that cardiologist exactly what to look for and when. Will you tell me your name again? Thomas said. Your full name. Amara Mensah. Amara, he said. He said it carefully like he was memorizing it. That's a good name. It means grace, she said. He smiled the first real smile she had seen from him. That tracks, he said. She left him and walked back through the corridor, which was now full of agents and officers and 2 separate medical teams that had come through the external entrance, and she moved through it with the same measured efficiency. She moved through everything, and people stepped out of her way without quite realizing they were doing it, the way people stepped out of the way of someone who knew exactly where they were going. She found Delroy sitting in one of the plastic waiting area chairs, which was the first time she had seen him sitting since they had pulled him from upstairs. An EMT was looking at his ribs with hands-on assessment, and Delroy was tolerating this with the patience of a man who had been through much worse medical interactions in much less comfortable settings. Bruised, not cracked, the EMT said. That's what I said, Delroy told him. I'm confirming it, the EMT said patiently. The agent processing Delroy's statement was standing nearby with a tablet, and he looked up when Amara approached. You know this individual, he said to her. We spoke during the incident, she said. The agent looked between them. He had the expression of someone who was beginning to understand that the statement he was taking was going to require significant revision. Gunnery Sergeant Delroy, he said. You said a nurse intervened in the situation upstairs before you were brought to the waiting area. That's correct, Delroy said. Can you describe that intervention? She told me through a door to stay low, Delroy said. I had thrown a crash cart through a window. She communicated calm through a closed door under active duress using about 6 words. I followed her instructions. She communicated through a closed door. She has that kind of voice, Delroy said simply. Amara said nothing. The agent looked at her. Ms. Mensah, did you communicate with the suspect on the 2nd floor prior to Gunnery Sergeant Delroy being brought to the waiting area? I assessed the situation from the ground floor and communicated what I could, yes, she said. Through a closed door. The door was between the stairwell and the 2nd floor landing. Sound carries in concrete stairwells. The agent wrote this down. He wrote it slowly, which was not the pace he had been writing at before. Delroy caught her eye. Something in his expression was the closest thing to humor she had seen on his face since he had arrived through the stairwell door in his hospital gown, and she acknowledged it with a minimal shift of her own expression, and then looked away before it could become anything that agents with tablets would feel the need to document. The first FBI agent was back. She had been on her phone, and now she walked directly to Amara with the purposeful stride of someone who had received information and needed to deliver it. She held her phone out. There was a name on the screen, a name and a rank and a branch and a set of commendations that took up most of the visible text. Amara looked at it. Your file, the agent said. I made a call. Amara looked at the phone, at the name on it, at the 12 years condensed into a government document that she had spent 41 days in scrubs that were slightly too big, carefully not mentioning. She felt something move in her chest that was not quite any of the things she had a word for. It was the feeling of being found. Not caught. Found. I'm aware of what's in my file, she said. I imagine you are, the agent said. She looked at Amara with a different quality than she had looked at her before, not less professional, but with an additional layer, the layer that appeared when one person recognized another person's specific kind of history. My name is Special Agent Dana Sue. I need to ask you some questions that are separate from the incident report if you're willing. I'm willing, Amara said. Not here, Sue said. Can you give me an hour after you've finished your immediate obligations to your patients? Amara thought about Kevin in the hallway, who was currently being attended to by a surgical team. She thought about Helen with the paramedics. She thought about Thomas with his settled rhythm strip. She thought about Patrice with her water cup standing straighter. She thought about Glenda moving through the room like a fixed point around which everything else orbited. 30 minutes, she said. I have obligations until then. Sue looked at her with something that might have been professionally suppressed, a small amount of admiration. 30 minutes, she agreed. Amara turned away and began the round that needed doing, because her patients were her patients, and the situation having resolved did not change that, and she moved through the aftermath of Veterans Memorial Hospital the way she had moved through 41 days of it efficiently and without drama checking and noting and adjusting. But there was a difference now. She could feel it in the way people's eyes followed her. Not the sideways glance of staff tolerating a new person who hadn't proven herself yet. Not the polite but distant attention of people who didn't know what category to put her in. Something different. Something that had changed in the room the moment she had put the gun on the floor and raised her hands and said, I'm the nurse on duty, and she was only now in the quiet of aftermath beginning to understand what that change meant and what it would cost her and what it might give her in return. The coin was still in her pocket. Gerald's pin was in her other pocket, warm against her fingers when she touched it. She had spent 12 years building something in the dark and 41 days hiding it in plain sight and approximately 1 hour using it in front of every person in this building. There was no going back from that. She was not sure, standing in the corridor of Veterans Memorial Hospital with the sound of federal agents and medical teams and people finally crying and finally laughing, filling the air around her, that going back was anything she wanted. A young nurse named Carlos, who had been on the second floor during the incident and had come down in the first wave of staff returning to their stations, fell into step beside her. He was 26, had been at the hospital for 8 months, and had the look of someone who had heard things secondhand that he was now seeing the aftermath of firsthand. Mensa, he said. Carlos, she said. Is it true, he said, that you disarmed a guy with a gun and then talked down Marcus Devlin? I disarmed one person, she said. 2 veterans and a retired Marine did the rest. Get their names for the record. That matters. He nodded, walking fast to keep pace with her. People are saying you were in the military. People can say what they want, she said. How are the patients on your floor? He blinked at the redirect and then answered it because she was moving and he was following. 2 of them heard the shots and had anxiety responses, both stabilized. One missed his afternoon medication window, I've noted it. One asked what the noise was, and when I told him there had been a security incident, he said, quote, I've been in worse situations than this, and went back to sleep. That sounds like Mr. Breckwith, she said. It was Mr. Breckwith, Carlos said. She almost smiled again. This time she let it go slightly further. They reached the nursing station, and she picked up the clipboard that had been on the floor since the short man had knocked it off the desk, set it back in its place, and pulled the next chart that needed attention. Everything that needed doing would get done in the order it needed doing with the same hand she had always used in the same building she had reported to for 41 days. The scrubs were still a size too large. She had not gotten around to exchanging them, and now she thought she might not. They were familiar now, and there were, it turned out, worse things to wear than clothes that fit you a little big when you were still figuring out who you were in a place that was still learning who you were. She opened the chart. She read it carefully. She went to do her job. 30 minutes turned into 45 because that was the nature of aftermath, and Special Agent Dana Sue was still waiting when Amara finally walked through the door of the small conference room that the hospital administration had made available to the FBI team. Sue was seated at the table with 2 cups of kefta, one on each side, and a closed folder in front of her that Amara recognized as the kind of folder that held printed documents rather than just notes. Amara sat down. She took the coffee because she needed it and because refusing it would have been theatrical. Kevin Park is in surgery, Sue said. They're saying he'll be fine. Good, Amara said. Helen Marsh is being admitted for monitoring. Her cardiologist says the stress event was significant, but not the primary issue. They found something that needs managing that they probably would have missed for another year if she hadn't come in today. Amara thought about that, about the way things that look like disasters sometimes redirected to something else entirely. Good, she said again. Sue folded her hands on top of the closed folder. I want to tell you what we know about Marcus Devlin before I ask you anything, she said, because I think context matters here. All right. Marcus Devlin has been on a federal watch list for 2 years. Narcotics distribution organized supply chain 4 states. What happened today was not random. Veterans Memorial Hospital was targeted specifically because of its pharmaceutical inventory profile. Sue paused. What that means is that he had inside information. Hospital layout, pharmacy access protocols, guard rotation. Someone gave him that. Amara set her coffee down. Staff. We think so. We don't know who yet. Sue opened the folder. What I want to ask you is this. During the incident, you had extended contact with all 4 men, Renner in particular. Did he say or do anything that suggested he had specific prior knowledge of this building? Amara thought back. She went through it methodically the way she went through everything in order without gaps. He knew the pharmacy was on the 2nd floor, she said. Marcus knew it too, but Renner moved upstairs without hesitation or orientation. He knew where to go. She paused. When we were in the corridor with Kevin, he watched my hands. He was assessing medical technique, not just watching. That's a specific kind of observation. It's the kind you develop when you're around medical environments for a reason. Sue wrote, You think he had been into the building before? I think he moved through it like he had, Amara said. That's all I can say with certainty. That's more than we had 20 minutes ago. Sue looked at her. Can I ask you something off the record? You can ask. Why nursing, Sue said. After 12 years in the program you were in, you could have gone any number of directions. Federal law enforcement, private sector, consulting. Why a hospital in a mid-sized city? Why a floor nursing position? Why here? Amara was quiet for a moment. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because she was deciding how much of the true one to give. The people here served, she said finally. They gave what I gave, and a lot of them gave more. And some of them are at the end of difficult roads, and I know how to take care of people under difficult conditions. It seemed like a reasonable match. That's the practical answer, Sue said. Yes, Amara agreed. Sue looked at her with the steady, non-pressuring attention of someone who was comfortable with silence and not going to fill it with noise just to be polite. Amara appreciated that. It was a quality she associated with a specific kind of person, the kind of person who had learned to wait because waiting had served them. I was tired, Amara said, not loudly, just evenly, the way she said most things. I was very good at a very hard thing for a very long time, and then I was tired, and I wanted to do something where I used what I had built without the weight of the other context. That's the real answer. Sue nodded once. And today, the context came back, Amara said. It does that. Sue closed the folder. She looked at Amara with an expression that was not pity and not admiration, and was something more considered than either. For what it's worth, she said, the way you managed that room today prevented what could have been a mass casualty event. I've worked a lot of these. I've seen what happens when someone panics in the wrong direction at the wrong moment. You didn't panic and you didn't let anyone else panic, and the difference between what happened and what could have happened is largely you. Amara said, the veterans in that room deserve equal credit. I know, Sue said. I'm giving it to them. I'm also giving it to you. Amara picked up her coffee again. She held it with both hands and looked at the table for a moment and then back at Sue. Is there anything else you need from me tonight? Not tonight, Sue said. We'll need you for a formal deposition. I'll be in contact. She stood and extended her hand across the table, and Amara stood and shook it, and Sue's grip was firm and direct, and she held it 1 second longer than a routine handshake. Take care of yourself, Miss Mensah. I will, Amara said. Thank you for the coffee. She walked out of the conference room and back into the corridor, And the hospital had changed in the way that hospitals changed after significant events, not in its structure or its sounds, but in its atmosphere, in the way the air felt slightly different, and the people moving through it moved with the careful deliberateness of people who were processing something while still doing their jobs. Dr. Voss was at the nursing station. He was standing rather than sitting, which was an improvement over an hour ago, and he had a cup of coffee that Glenda had presumably produced because Glenda was the kind of person who produced coffee for people who needed it without being asked. He looked up when Amara came around the corner. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said 41 days. Gerald said the same thing, she said. Gerald is a perceptive man. Voss set his coffee down. I owe you an apology. You don't. I do, he said. 3 weeks ago, I told Glenda that your chart documentation was thorough, but that you seemed uncertain in fast-moving situations. I based that on one interaction during a trauma case where I misread your pace as hesitation. He stopped. He looked for a moment genuinely embarrassed, which was an expression she had not seen on his face before, and which suited him in an unexpected way by making him look human. I was wrong. You were reading available information, she said. The information was incomplete. That's generous. It's accurate, she said. He picked up his coffee again. He was quiet for a moment. The FBI agent told me your background. Not all of it, I suspect, but enough. He looked at her. Why didn't you tell anyone? I didn't need to, she said. I came here to be a nurse. The rest of it was mine. He thought about that. She could see him turning it over, applying it to everything he thought he understood about her revising. The way you move through triage when we have high-volume evenings, he said slowly. I always thought it was unusual. The way you don't accelerate, you don't rush, but you're always done before anyone else, and nothing's been missed. Combat pace, she said. You learn to move like there's no margin, but panic costs more than it saves, so you cut panic and keep the pace, Amara. Voss looked at her for a long moment. I'd like to talk to hospital administration tomorrow morning, he said, about your role here, about what your actual capacity is and whether it's being used correctly. She looked at him carefully. What does that mean? It means I think we've been using a very particular instrument as though it were a general one, he said, and I'd like to discuss whether there's a better arrangement. With you first, before I say anything to anyone. She thought about that, about what it meant to be seen in a context she had chosen specifically because it did not require being seen. About whether being seen was something she had been ready for when she took this job, or whether she was only becoming ready for it now on the other side of today. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm asking, Voss said. She nodded and moved past him back toward the floor, and she was halfway down the corridor when she heard the voice. Cobra. She stopped. Delroy was in the doorway of a family waiting area that had been commandeered as a secondary staging space for statements. He was dressed in actual clothes now, someone having retrieved his belongings from his room, and he looked substantially more like himself than he had in a hospital gown, which was to say, he looked like a man who took up a specific amount of space and was entirely comfortable with how much that was. She turned and faced him. They're keeping me another night, he said, the ribs plus the monitoring from before. He moved into the corridor. I want to say something and I want to say it right, so I'm going to take a minute to find the words. Take the time, she said. He looked at the floor briefly, the way people looked at the floor when they were organizing something internally. Then he looked back up. I've been in a lot of rooms, he said. A lot of situations where the outcome depended on someone making the right decision at the right time and having the nerve to follow through on it. I've seen people who trained for years fold in those moments. And I've seen people who looked like they had no business being there become the reason everyone walked out. He paused. You were the reason everyone walked out today. She said there were a lot of people in that room. There were, he said, and you held every one of them together. That's not training, or it's not only training, that's character. He reached into his pocket. He took out his own coin, larger than hers, heavier looking, and held it for a moment with the fingers of both hands. Team 8, I want to know your deployment record. You can't access that. Probably not through official channels, he said. But I know people who knew people who served alongside your team, and I've had about 40 minutes to make phone calls, and a name keeps coming up that I think is yours. And if it's yours, then I need you to know that the people who were there remember it. She was still. What name? Kandahar 2016, he said. Medical evacuation under fire 3 hours behind enemy lines, 4 casualties, extracted alive. The medic who held the perimeter alone for 18 minutes while her team got the wounded to the bird. The corridor was very quiet. She had not spoken about that operation to anyone outside of a classified debrief since it happened. It was in a file somewhere. It was in the file that Dana Sue had pulled up on her phone. It was in the records that existed because events of that kind required records regardless of how deeply you wanted them not to. But she had never said it out loud to someone who understood what it meant. 18 minutes is a long time, Delroy said quietly. It felt longer, she said. He nodded once. He held the coin out. This is from a Marine, he said, to someone who earned it outside the Corps and doesn't care about that distinction, which is the only kind of person a Marine gives one of these to. She looked at the coin in his hand. She already had Gerald's pin in one pocket and her own coin in the other. She was running out of pockets for things that mattered. She took it. He nodded the Marine kind of nod that carried a paragraph of things that didn't need to be said out loud. She gave it back. And then the quiet of the corridor was interrupted by the sound of wheels on linoleum, and Gerald came around the corner in his wheelchair with the unhurried confidence of a man who had somewhere to be and was entirely aware that everyone would wait for him. He looked at Delroy. "Gunnery Sergeant," he said. "Gerald," Delroy said, "were you giving my nurse a hard time?" "I was paying her a compliment." "Try to tell the difference," Gerald said, and rolled to a stop beside them and looked at Amara with the direct, uncomplicated warmth that she had come to understand was just how Gerald was with people he had decided were worth being warm toward, and Gerald had decided quickly. "They're going to transfer me to the surgical recovery floor tomorrow," he said. "Different nurses." "You'll be fine," she said. "I know I'll be fine," he said. "I've survived worse than a hip replacement. I survived today." He paused. "I want you to know something. I've been coming to this hospital for 11 years. I've had a lot of nurses, good ones most of them, but I've never had one who looked at a man with a gun and thought tactically about his psychology while simultaneously managing a cardiac patient and a monitoring alert in the back room." He looked at her steadily. "You know what that is?" "Training," she said. "No, blah," he said. "Training is the tool. What you have is different. What you have is what separates the people who do their job from the people who define the job." He tapped the globe and anchor pin through the fabric of her scrub pocket. She felt it. "Don't let anyone make you small again," he said. "Not even yourself." She didn't trust her voice for a moment. She stood in the corridor of Veterans Memorial Hospital, and she looked at Gerald in his wheelchair and Delroy beside him, and the weight of everything that day had been pressed through her and come out the other side as something she didn't entirely have a word for yet, but it was not small. "I won't," she said. The next morning, the hospital was different in the way that mornings were different after the days that changed things. It was not quieter or louder. It smelled the same. The fluorescence still had that particular quality. The coffee cart was still out of the roast that Dr. Hendricks preferred, and Dr. Hendricks still minded, and the chart cart still needed restocking on the 3rd floor. But when Amara walked through the main entrance in her scrubs that were slightly too large, people looked at her differently. Not all of them. Not in an obvious way that anyone choreographed, but the looks were different, the angle of them, the duration. Carlos gave her a nod that was not a new nurse nod. The security guard at the desk stood up slightly when she passed and then seemed to catch himself, but didn't entirely sit back down. Patrice was already at the nurse's station. She had her hair up and her coffee and her tablet, and she looked tired in the honest way of a person who had not slept well but had shown up anyway. And when she saw Amara, she said, "Morning," in a tone that was not the tone of someone tolerating a newcomer. "Morning," Amara said. "Helen Marsh left a voicemail for the floor," Patrice said. "She wants to send flowers. I told the overnight team it was for you specifically, but they noted it as general staff." "General staff is fine," Amara said. "I changed it back," Patrice said. "It's for you." Amara looked at her for a moment. Patrice met the look with the steady, uncomplicated directness of a person who had made a small decision and was not interested in debating it. Amara nodded once and picked up the first chart of the morning. At 9:15, hospital administrator Margaret Osei called Amara into her office, and Dr. Voss was already there, and Dana Sue's card was on the desk beside a printed document that Amara recognized as a formal commendation request from the FBI. Osei was a small woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain and the particular posture of someone who had run a complex institution for a long time and was not intimidated by anything administrative. She was, however, looking at Amara with the expression of a woman who was recalibrating something fundamental and had enough self-awareness to acknowledge it. "I want to offer you a different position," Osei said without preamble, because she was also the kind of woman who did not traffic in preamble. "Trauma response lead. It's a created position. We've needed it for some time and haven't had a candidate who fit." She paused. "You fit." Amara looked at the document, then at Voss, then at Osei. "What does the role involve?" "Emergency protocol coordination, training, first response integration between medical and security, crisis management." Osei folded her hands. "And floor nursing. You keep your patients. That wasn't negotiable for you, and it isn't for me either, because I have reviewed your 41 days of charts, and your documentation is the best I've seen from a first-year staff member in 20 years. Voss said nothing. He had clearly already said what he had to say before Amara arrived and was now simply present as a supporting fact. Amara looked at the commendation on the desk. She thought about 12 years and 41 days and 18 minutes in a corridor, and Gerald's pin and Delroy's coin and her own coin warm against her leg, and the particular feeling of standing in a room full of people who were afraid and knowing with absolute certainty what to do. She thought about being tired, about choosing this place precisely because it was quieter than the other thing. She thought about whether quiet was what she had wanted, or whether she had confused quiet with safety and safety with peace, and whether those were in fact the same thing. They were not the same thing. She knew that now, sitting in this office with the morning light coming through the window and the hospital running around her with its ordinary, extraordinary demands, its Geralds and its Helens and its Thomas Breckwiths and its Patrices and its Dr. Vosses. She had come here because she was tired of the wait, and the wait had found her anyway because the wait was not external. It was her. It was the thing she was made of. You did not get to set it down and walk away. You learned to carry it differently. "Yes," she said. Osei nodded once. Voss exhaled slightly. Neither of them made it into more than it was, and Amara appreciated that more than she could easily say. She went back to the floor. At 11:40, she stopped at the door of Gerald's room because she had said she would check on him, and she kept what she said. He was sitting up in the bed with the television off, which was unusual for Gerald, who generally had a game on regardless of the time of day. He was looking at his hands. "You're not watching anything," she said. "I'm thinking," he said. "What about—" He looked up. "My grandson's Little League game is this Saturday," he said. "I told you about it. I was supposed to be there." "You might still make it," she said. "Discharge is day after tomorrow if the hip is tracking right." He looked at her with the expression of a man recalculating. "You think—" "I think if you do everything you're supposed to do today and tomorrow, it's possible," she said. "I think if you do anything you're not supposed to do, it isn't. So don't do anything you're not supposed to do." "That's a lot of conditions," he said. "Those are the conditions," she said. He smiled. It was the full kind, the kind that used his whole face, and it made him look younger by about 15 years. "You're going to be here when I come back," he said, "for my next hip thing. The other one's going to need replacing eventually. Dr. Morrison keeps threatening." "I'll be here," she said. "Promise." She thought about the commendation on Osei's desk, about the position with the title that hadn't existed yesterday, about the floor she would keep and the patients who were hers and the hospital that had spent 41 days learning who she was and had, in one morning, learned all of it at once. "Promise," she said. He nodded. He picked up the remote control and turned the television on. There was a game somewhere that she didn't recognize, and he settled back into his pillows with the contentment of a man who had done what needed doing and was now entitled to a game. She walked back down the corridor to the nurse's station. She picked up the chart that needed doing. She did the thing that needed doing next, and then the thing after that with the same hand she had always had in the building that was now fully hers in a way it had not been at 7 o'clock the morning before. At some point, someone would tell the story of what had happened in Veterans Memorial Hospital. The FBI report would tell one version. The news would tell another. The patients who had been in that waiting room would tell their families, and the families would tell other people, and details would shift and grow and simplify the way stories did when they moved through people who hadn't been there. But the true version was this. A woman walked into a hospital wearing scrubs that were too big, having spent 12 years becoming the most capable person in almost any room she entered, and spent 41 days allowing the room to believe otherwise. And on the morning that the room needed what she had, she gave it completely and without hesitation, not because she was trying to prove something, but because the people in that room were her people now, and her people did not get left behind. She had been a warrior in dark places for 12 years. She had chosen to become a healer in a lit one. She was, it turned out, both. She had always been both. And Veterans Memorial Hospital on an ordinary Tuesday that became something else entirely was where she finally stopped choosing between them. Amara Oi Mensah clipped Gerald's pin to her badge, placed her coin in her breast pocket, and went to take care of her patients. She was exactly where she was supposed to be.